Welcome to a video presentation on acceptable use policy presented by me, Nicholas Andrews. Today's presentation will look at what is an acceptable use policy, why is it important, what does it mean for students and teachers, how it should be communicated to a school district community, and how it can be implemented in the classroom, school, and school district. First, it is important to understand what is an acceptable use policy, commonly referred to as the AUP. According to Common Sense Education, an acceptable use policy is a policy that outlines in writing how a school or district expects its community members to behave with technology. Simply put, it is the guidelines and rules developed by the school district to govern technology usage in the educational setting. This includes specific policies for student and teacher technology usage. An acceptable use policy identifies the do's and don'ts when using technology, hardware, and software during instructional time. An acceptable use policy should specify what devices can be used, how they can be used, and consequences for failing to abide by the acceptable use policies. This can include information on using district-supplied hardware or software, uses of personal electronic devices by teachers and students, limitations on internet access and usage, and any other policies regarding technology needed to address the needs of a particular school or school district. But why is an AUP needed? Although some people may believe policies limiting technology are unnecessary, they are important in the modern day of technology integrated school systems. Most importantly, an acceptable use policy must be established to protect the students and employees of a school district. The established policies are meant to prevent students and teachers from accessing inappropriate content, becoming victim to vicious malware or viruses, and sharing secure information about themselves or others. Along with protecting students and employees, an acceptable use policy also protects the hardware and software used by the members of the school district. This can include technology supplied by the school district or personal electronic devices used by students and staff. This includes physical protection of electronics and software protection from intruding malware or viruses. Abiding by acceptable use policy will help ensure technology works efficiently when needed for instructional purposes. Along with protection, a school district's acceptable use policy also includes policies needed to meet the requirements of state and federal laws which protect the privacy and rights of students and employees. Some of these laws include the Children's Internet Protection Act, the Maryland Public Information Act, and several others. But besides protection, an acceptable use policy is also meant to provide students and teachers with access to technology devices and applications to make learning more engaging and meaningful. This includes access to desktops, laptops, internet, applications, and allowing usage of personal electronic devices. Overall, an acceptable use policy is meant to protect and provide technology. However, it can be difficult to balance protection and access for students and teachers without a clearly defined and well-written acceptable use policy. Most school districts have an acceptable use policy for students. In my school district, the acceptable use policy for students can be found in the Code of Student Conduct and the BYOD Acceptable Use Agreement. Both are given to students on their first day of school each year. They're not directly labeled as an acceptable use policy, but they embody the essence of what it's meant to be. When it comes to students, there are several important factors of the acceptable use policy, but there are differences for schools that use BYOD and those that do not. The first section of the acceptable use policy is on cell phones and personal electronic devices. According to our acceptable use policy, students are not allowed to possess cell phones and other electronic devices on school property. This includes at school, on a school bus, or on school chartered vehicles, or at any school-sponsored activities before, during, or after the school day. This restriction also applies to field trips and travel to and from school-sponsored activities such as competitions and sporting events. But these policies have clear identifications for elementary, middle, and high school students with varying differences. For instance, elementary school students cannot have a cell phone on school property unless a parent or guardian receives written approval from the school principal. Cell phones can be used, though, if they are attending and not participating in events happening after school hours that are open to the general public. Middle school students can possess a cell phone, but it must be powered off and stored in the locker during the day. It can be not used for any purposes while on school property unless a parent or guardian receives written approval from the school principal beforehand. Again, cell phones can be used when students attend but are not participating in events happening after school hours that are open to the general public. High school students, though, can possess a cell phone, but is to remain non-visible and powered off during the school day. But setting a phone to vibrate or silent is not considered off. A cell phone can be used when students attend but are not participating in events happening after school hours and open to the general public. But students can use a cell phone to briefly contact parents and guardians while traveling to or from school-sponsored events on a school bus or other school-sponsored vehicles. But students can only do so when given permission from a coach or sponsor. As an all-encompassing rule, at any time or age, a cell phone or other personal electronic device should never disrupt the school setting or instructional time. And my school district goes into saying that while participating in AP testing, state testing, or other testing situations, all personal electronics must be powered off and placed in a location inaccessible to students. The next section of our acceptable use policy talks about internet usage. It clearly identifies that internet should only be used for educational purposes as designated by a teacher. All computers and equipment should be treated with care and respect, and that students may search the internet, download information, and access email when it has educational value. However, all information needs to be correctly accredited to the author or authors in accordance with copyright laws. Along with internet usage, students can never access social media sites such as Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and may not use technology to bully other individuals, whether it's on or off school grounds. Students are also prohibited from using offensive behavior, pictures, or other materials while using the internet. And students should retain personal information such as phone numbers, addresses, usernames, and passwords from public information, generally meaning they are not allowed to share any of that information. And again, at no point should a student attempt to damage a computer system or its files. The next section actually comes from the BYOD Acceptable Use Agreement, which somewhat conflicts with the Student Code of Conduct. Students in schools that choose to adopt the BYOD program have a different set of acceptable use policies. However, the possession of a personal communication device is a privilege, and those devices can be confiscated and or searched if the device's usage does not align with some of the following policies, such as all devices must be in silent or vibrate mode during while on school property. No device should be used to take pictures, record audio or video, and devices should not be used to distribute pictures, audio, or videos, even if they were created during non-school hours or events. Furthermore, a device's speakers must be turned off, but students can use headphones to listen to audio content. As a big rule, personal communication devices cannot be used during testing, and that students can only use their devices for educational purposes when deemed appropriate by the teacher. But before a student can use their personal communication device, they must return a signed agreement from their parent and guardian. Internet access will be available for students, but cannot be guaranteed. And at no point is the school responsible for safety, security, or maintenance of a personal electronic devices. Students should participate in BYOD at their own risk. Going along with our our code of student conduct and BYOD acceptable use policy is signed contracts. Before a student can access any technology or software or hardware, they must return the code of student conduct agreement signed by themselves and the parent and guardian. The agreement will be distributed to students on the first day of school each year and then collected by their teacher during the first week of school. Their signature indicates they have read and understood the policy set by the Code of Student Conduct. Likewise, before students can use BYOD, they must return the BYOD acceptable use agreement. There are several consequences if students decide to violate the acceptable use policy. Depending on what type of violation and the number of occurrences, students can face consequences from in-class modifications, up to in-school suspension, or even out-of-school suspension. Minor infractions can be dealt with directly by the teacher, while more severe or repetitive infractions will require the involvement of administrators and parents. If a student's action caused physical or network damage to the school district's technology systems, students may be also required to pay to have the damage fixed. All of this information can be accessed on the school district's website, with the Code of Student Conduct links being under the student parents, and in specifically the technology sections on pages 9 through 11. You can also find the BYOD acceptable use agreement on the school's website under the parent student tab. Not only is there acceptable use policy for students, but one for teachers and other employees of the school district as well. It can be located in the employee manual, which is posted on the school website under the teacher portal. It's not labeled as an acceptable use policy, but it has the same concepts. And it lays out several guidelines for teachers when using technology. The first talking about the conduct and use, specifically how we use email and voicemails to communicate. With this being the case, the school district has the right to access these types of messages and information that are sent through email and voicemail. Teachers need to understand that these types of communications are not private, and that the school district does not regularly monitor these messages, but they have the right to do so. More so, these emails and voicemails should be considered confidential and only accessible by the intended receiver. Also under the conduct and use, the school district, or in the acceptable use policy, identifies that teachers should refrain from things such as accessing unauthorized email systems or other applications, tampering with the hardware or software, using inappropriate language, pictures, and other materials, or introducing malware or viruses purposely into the system. Teachers should also refrain from using the technology systems for commercial advertising, chain letters, or non-educational games, or using the network for personal gain or illegal activities. The conduct and use also specifies that creating, accessing, sharing, downloading, or printing content which is inappropriate is strictly forbidden. This contains any content which may impede on the rights of others or cause a disruption to the school district activities. The acceptable use policy also goes on to talk about the physical security of technology. It states that technology equipment should not be removed from the school district property, and that teachers should take reasonable precautions to protect the school district-owned technology against damage, theft, or loss. And if a teacher is found to be neglectful, they can be held accountable for the damages or loss of any technology devices. Under this section, it also says that teachers should refrain from using personal communication devices during the workday unless their school is participating in the BYOD program. However, the technology department has the ability and right to track personal devices brought onto school district property. And if a teacher's device becomes responsible for any malware or viruses brought on to the school district network, the teacher can be held responsible for any damages. And lastly, any devices connected to the school district network can be tracked electronically. The next section talks about electronic data security, and that teachers and other school district employees are responsible for managing their user account security. That their passwords and accounts should not be shared for any reason, and at no point can teachers use autofill password features. And when teachers leave a workstation, they must log off all the computers, and that other students or teachers or any other personnel can never use your account. And it goes on to say that teachers must make sure that all data and sensitive files are in a secure location, and that they are confidential and should not be shared unless that was an intent to be shared with general public or specific individuals. Lastly, teachers should not store their personal files or pictures on the school district's network. Along with this, we talk about the acceptable use policy talks about network security. The school district takes no responsibility for information found on the internet, and that the school district has filters all computers on the system by using web filtering software and spam filtering software. And when teachers are using the school district network, they should only be accessing relevant information to the educational or business purposes. They should also post information to the school district network or internet site, which is for educational or business purpose only. And that teachers are not allowed to remotely access the school district network unless they have been authorized from a supervisor. Furthermore, the acceptable use policy talks about electronic communications. In the school districts, teachers have the program called Edline, where they can create their own websites for their classes. But all materials posted to teacher sites are the property of the school district. And the school district has the right to review all information posted to a teacher's Edline website. These materials can be removed or edited if they do not contain educational purpose. Next, the acceptable use policy talks about BYOD. Teachers can bring and use their own personal communication devices, such as laptops, tablets, and smartphones. And they may connect those devices to the school district's network for approved classroom activities. But the teachers are responsible for the safety of their own devices. As stated earlier, if a teacher's device is responsible for introducing malware or viruses, they can be held accountable for those damages. If teachers don't abide by these, there are several consequences. Minor offenses may require teachers to be reprimanded by administrators, while for more severe offenses, teachers can be placed on administrative leave until an investigation of the situation can be conducted, sometimes resulting in termination of the teacher's employment. If a teacher's actions are found to be neglectful of physical or network-based technologies, teachers can also be required to pay for the damages. The entire acceptable use policy for teachers can be found on pages 20 to 23 of the employee manual. And the employee manual can be accessed from the school district's website through the employee portal. Even though the school district has an acceptable use policy in place for students and teachers, it is also very important to communicate these policies and its underlying principles to students, parents, and teachers. First off, this is done through hard copies. For students, each year they receive paper copies of the Code of Student Conduct and BYOD Acceptable Use Agreement on the first day of school. These copies, the school district requires these forms to be signed by a parent or guardian and returned to the school before students may use any technology devices or applications supplied by the school district. However, many parents do not read or comprehend the policies set by this acceptable use policy. However, furthermore, teachers do not receive hard copies of the employee manual, but the teachers do agree to its terms when they sign the employment contract for the school district. Besides the hard copies, teachers and students are required to agree to the school district's usage notice posted prior to a logon screen when they are accessing any district-owned computer system. The usage notice appears before the logon screen and states that the user is agreeing to the terms and conditions of the employee manual and code of student conduct when they press OK. More so, the usage notice also notifies users that all records, reports, email, software, and other information accessed on the device is the property of the school district. These are things that the school district is already doing, but I think there are other ways that we can communicate the AUP to our students, parents, and teachers. For instance, posters. The school district already has pre-made posters which are available for printing from the school district's website. The poster briefly states the general policy set by the BYOD Acceptable Use Agreement. Yes, these pre-made posters are helpful and should be posted to teachers in teachers' classrooms and around the school, but teachers should also take on and create their own. If teachers decide to do so, they should keep the posters simple and concise. Teachers can choose to create and enforce their own policies and procedures for managing technology in their classroom, as long as it still abides by the acceptable use policy put in place by the school district. However, it would be great if teachers in the same school decided to create a standardized poster which meets and reiterates the policies set by the acceptable use policies. Along with this Code of Student Conduct, the BYOD Acceptable Use Agreement, and Employee Handbook are all posted on the district's website. The Code of Student Conduct and BYOD Acceptable Use Agreement can be accessed by clicking the student's parents link from the school district homepage. Under the link, you can access either document by clicking Code of Student Conduct or BYOD links. Teachers can access the Employee Handbook by logging into the Employee Portal from the school district's website. From the Employee Portal homepage, teacher can find the Employee Handbook by clicking Document, then Employee Manual. These documents can be accessed by any device with a web browser application. These are some of the ways that we kind of are already doing this, but I believe we can communicate it better through multimedia information. The acceptable use policy is readily available to students, parents, and teachers, but only if they're intentionally looking for it. Even with access to acceptable use policies, it may be hard or difficult to comprehend and requires a substantial amount of time and dedication to read word for word. Therefore, the acceptable use policy should be supplemented with additional multimedia information. Perhaps teachers may choose to create a short videos briefly explaining what the acceptable use policy means for students. Likewise, the school board may consider creating video presentations to help teachers understand how the acceptable use policy applies to them as well. The school district also already requires teachers to complete several online trainings each year, so perhaps the training on the acceptable use policy for teachers could be included as well. Video is only one means of presenting the information from the acceptable use policy. This information could also be presented through podcasts, infographics, or teacher-made websites, and other multimedia means. Perhaps the most effective method of communicating the acceptable use policy is in the classroom. Teachers should be aware of the do's and don'ts when it comes to student technology usage. They are capable of quickly communicating the ideals of the acceptable use policy to students directly and should do so whenever technology is being used. Teachers should also actively monitor student usage during technology-enhanced learning activities and redirect behavior when necessary. Constant reminders and monitoring student usage may be the only direct means of communicating the acceptable use policy to students. However, this requires teachers to become knowledgeable on the student and teacher acceptable use policy. Along with communicating, there's also the implementation of the student acceptable use policy. The communication is important, but probably the best way is to set the tone when implementing the student acceptable use policy. Teachers should be clearly identify what is and what is not acceptable use. This means addressing text messaging, accessing websites, photos, videos, and other possible possible technology usages students may encounter throughout the year. Some teachers may even decide to include references to acceptable use policy within their syllabus or post their own policies and procedures in the classroom. Generally, it is easier to give up control than to regain control. Be strict with the acceptable use policy in the beginning and give students more freedom as they demonstrate personal responsibility when using technology. Teachers also can implement it by instilling just policy reminders. Teachers may communicate their expectations in the acceptable use policy during the first few days of school, but they should constantly remind students of their expectations before and during activities involving technology. If a teacher is aware of a potential risk, address that risk with students before the activity. During the activity, monitor student usage and redirect behavior when necessary. This does not mean that teachers should administer strict consequences for minor offenses of the acceptable use policy, but re-communicate your expectations. But if a student is repeatedly violating the acceptable use policy or is found to be majorly violating the acceptable use policy, then it's time to report the student to a vice principal or for administrative consequences. Furthermore, teachers can also model digital citizenship. Although they are setting and reinforcing policies to the acceptable use policy, teachers also need to model that type of behavior in the classroom. Students will immediately recognize the differences in what a teacher says and what a teacher does. Be aware that students will notice if you are not abiding by your own policies. If a teacher wants their students to use technology for educational purposes only, then they must do the same. Abide by the same policies you want your students to follow. Use technology only for administrative and educational purposes. Generally, teachers should strive to meet standard 5.2 of the ISTE Technology Coach Standards on Digital Citizenship, which states technology coaches model and promote digital citizenship. In terms of the acceptable use policy, Standard 5.2 states that technology coach should model and facilitate safe, healthy, legal, and ethical uses of digital information and technologies. Many teachers may not consider themselves as a technology coach, but we are. Therefore, it is important to model what it means in terms of our school district's acceptable use policy. This also means planning lessons where you address and model how to be safe when searching the internet, or how to abide by fair use and avoid plagiarizing, and demonstrating positive interactions through technology, whether it be through social media, email, or other communication applications. Lessons in technology activities should be planned to teach and model these important features of digital citizenship. Along with this, in modeling in all these policies, is you can have open discussions with your students. Explain why there is an acceptable use policy, and that it's there to protect the student, teacher, and school district's infrastructure from malicious sources. Discussions on how accessing websites and downloading materials can negatively impact the school district network can have a very personal effect. These open discussions can be very personal and positive experiences for students, which help them better understand the why behind the acceptable use policy. Along with this, teachers can also try to go above and beyond and supply students with supplement materials based on acceptable use policies and digital citizenship. These resources could be posted to the teacher's online website or given to students before or during technology activities. And one of the biggest things for me is to reinforce the policies. It is important that all teachers and administrators reinforce the acceptable use policy and consequences. One-time minor offenses may be overlooked or dealt with by a teacher in the classroom. However, repeated violations or major violations of the acceptable use policy need to be addressed. Students must know that the acceptable use policy is strictly enforced by all teachers and administrators to prevent future violations. But there is also some differences with the implementation of the acceptable use policy for teachers. Mainly, knowledge is power. The most effective way of implementing the acceptable use policy for teachers is by educating them about that policy. This does not have to be done through professional development or meetings, but could be supported by openly encouraging teachers to review the employee manual and the acceptable use policy for teachers. There are many policies I believe teachers are just unaware of. However, many teachers may still not want to read the acceptable use policy on their own time. Our school district already mandates several online trainings at the beginning of each year. It may be important to consider an online training for teachers on the acceptable use policy within the school district, along with our already required trainings. As a general kind of rule, keep it professional. It is important to be educated about the acceptable use policy and how it applies to teachers, but there are some general guidelines teachers can follow. Keep it professional during the school day. Technology devices should be used for business and educational purposes only. Refrain from surfing the web while using the school district's devices network. Respond to emails and voicemails in a professional manner. And generally embody the principles of digital citizenship whether you're using when you are using technology for school. And my final and last kind of implementation rule, if you're not sure, don't do it. If it is something you can do or access on your own time and device, then it can wait till later. However, it is something you think it is necessary to advance the educational purpose, ask an administrator or review the acceptable use policy to be sure. In conclusion, it is important for the school district to have an acceptable use policy which protects and provides technology to students and teachers. It may seem as if the acceptable use policy is too limiting and restrictive, but its purpose is to protect students, teachers, and the school district. Before agreeing to the terms set by the acceptable use policy, students, parents, and teachers should be aware of its rules and guidelines. Teachers should also assist the school district when implementing the acceptable use policy by involving the principles of digital citizenship into their lessons. This requires teachers to communicate the acceptable use policy in their own policies when using technology in the classroom, while also modeling that behavior aligned to the acceptable use policy in digital citizenship. Teachers should also educate themselves on the acceptable use policy and how it applies to them. By doing so, they can protect themselves from consequences and repercussions. In addition to the information presented here is also a list of several resources which may help you better understand an acceptable use policy. I urge you to visit some of these sites or do your own research on acceptable use policies to gain further insights. I hope you have enjoyed and learned from this presentation on the acceptable use policy. This is Nicholas Andrews saying thank you for watching.